this family photograph from 1914, the father's eyes hide a hidden secret. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the climate-controlled archive room of the Boston Historical Society, her hands trembling slightly as she held the glass plate negative up to the light. The photograph, taken in April 1914, showed a family of 5 posed stiffly in their Sunday best outside a modest wooden house in Lynn, Massachusetts. The father, Thomas Reed, sat centered, his wife Mary standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, their 3 children arranged around them. Sarah had seen thousands of old photographs in her career as a genetic researcher specializing in hereditary eye conditions, but this one had been flagged by the Society's new digital scanning project. When they'd amplified the image to museum-quality resolution, something unusual had appeared in Thomas Reed's eyes, something that shouldn't have been visible in a 1914 photograph. She returned to her laptop and opened the high-resolution scan. Zooming in on Thomas's face, she adjusted the contrast and brightness. His expression was serious, typical for the era's long exposure times, but his eyes held something else. In the deep blacks of his pupils, barely perceptible even at this magnification, were tiny specks of lighter pigmentation arranged in a distinctive pattern around the retina. Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen this pattern before, in modern fundus photographs of patients with retinitis pigmentosa, a progressive genetic condition that slowly steals vision. But how could a simple portrait camera from 1914 have captured such detail? She pulled up Thomas Reed's file. Born 1878 in Lynn, worked as a machinist at the General Electric plant, died 1952. 3 children, Robert, Elizabeth, and James. The file mentioned that Robert had gone blind in his 40s, cause unknown. Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't just an interesting historical photograph. This was potentially a documented case of inherited retinitis pigmentosa spanning multiple generations. If Thomas had known about his condition, if he'd documented it somehow, his records could provide unprecedented insight into the disease's progression, data that modern medicine desperately needed. The investigation was just beginning. Sarah spent the next morning at the Lynn Public Library, searching through city directories and employment records. Thomas Reed appeared consistently from 1898 through 1951. Machinist, same address on Magnolia Street, married to Mary in 1902. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained the photograph. Then she found something odd in the GE Plant's employee newsletter from March 1915. A small notice congratulated Thomas Reed on his promotion to night shift supervisor, precision grinding department. Night shift. For a man whose vision should have been deteriorating, especially in low light, this seemed contradictory. In a 1918 newsletter, another mention, Thomas Reed continues to demonstrate exceptional skill in close tolerance work, despite challenging conditions. The phrasing felt careful, almost protective. That afternoon, Sarah visited the Lynn Museum. Among dusty boxes of GE Plant records, she found personnel files. Thomas's file was thin, employment dates, wage increases, nothing personal. But paperclipped to the back was a handwritten note dated 1923, signed by a supervisor named Harold. T. Reed remains our most reliable night machinist. His methods are unorthodox, but results are consistently excellent. Recommend continued employment regardless of physical considerations. Physical considerations. Sarah's hands went cold. Someone had known. Her phone rang. It was Robert, a retired GE engineer she'd contacted earlier. Dr. Mitchell? You asked about Thomas Reed. My grandfather Harold worked with him, actually supervised him for 20 years. Did your grandfather ever mention anything unusual about Thomas? After grandfather died, we found his journals. He wrote about the plant, the men he supervised. There's a whole section about Thomas Reed. Said he was the most remarkable machinist he'd ever known. Robert paused. Said Thomas had developed some kind of system, compensated for something grandfather never quite understood, used touch and memory more than sight. Sarah's heart raced. Would you be willing to share those journals? Already pulled them out when you called. There's something else, though. Grandfather mentioned that Thomas kept his own notebooks, detailed technical journals. Said Thomas once told him they weren't about machines. They were about seeing in the dark. Robert's living room smelled of old paper and coffee. Spread across his dining table were 5 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed but intact. Harold had been meticulous, dating each entry, organizing observations by year and worker. Sarah photographed the pages about Thomas Reed, her excitement growing with each entry. Harold had noticed Thomas's unusual methods by 1916. T. Reed positions his face inches from the workpiece, tracing edges with his fingertips before cutting. Other men rely on sight alone and make more errors. By 1920, the observations grew more specific. Thomas asked for additional lighting at his station, but only indirect sources, says direct light causes him pain. He's developed remarkable spatial memory, can navigate the entire shop floor in complete darkness during air raid drills. And then in 1925, Thomas confided something today, said he's been preparing for the inevitable since before the war. Wouldn't elaborate, but mentioned he's keeping records. For my children, he said. So they'll know what's coming. Sarah looked up at Robert. Did your grandfather ever see these records? No, Thomas was intensely private about them. Robert pulled out another journal, smaller. This was grandfather's personal diary. There's an entry from 1952, right after Thomas died. Sarah read aloud. Attended Thomas Reed's funeral today. His son Robert told me his father left behind 17 notebooks, detailed observations about his vision, how it changed over the years, techniques he developed to cope. Robert seemed shaken, said his father had been going blind since his 20s, had known it would happen. The notebooks are locked in a trunk. The family isn't ready to open them yet. 17 notebooks. Decades of first-hand documentation of retinitis pigmentosa, recorded by someone who understood both the technical and human aspects of progressive vision loss. Do you know what happened to Thomas's family? Sarah asked. Robert nodded slowly. Robert Reed went blind too, just like his father predicted. Died in 1989, but he had children. There's a granddaughter, lives in Massachusetts. 3 days later, Sarah drove through the tree-lined streets of Brookline, rehearsing what she'd say. Thomas Reed's granddaughter, Ellen, had been hesitant on the phone, suspicious of a stranger asking about family history, particularly medical conditions. Sarah had convinced her by sending the amplified photograph. Ellen's house was a well-maintained colonial with a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. She answered quickly, a woman in her mid-60s with sharp blue eyes behind thick glasses. Dr. Mitchell, come in. The living room was bright, full of family photographs. Ellen gestured to the couch and sat across from Sarah. I need to be direct with you, Doctor. Why are you really interested in my grandfather? Sarah met her gaze. Because I believe he documented something extraordinary. Your grandfather had retinitis pigmentosa, a progressive genetic condition, the same condition your father had. Ellen's expression didn't change, and the same condition I have. I was diagnosed at 32. My night vision was already failing. She touched her glasses. I'm 64 now. I have about 15% of my visual field left. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sarah leaned forward. Ellen, in 1914 there was no treatment, barely any understanding of RP. Your grandfather worked as a precision machinist for over 40 years despite having this condition. His supervisor's journals suggest he kept detailed records. Those records could help us understand the disease in ways modern medicine hasn't been able to study. The notebooks. Ellen's voice was quiet. My father talked about them sometimes toward the end. Said his father had left him a roadmap, instructions for navigating the darkness. Do you have them? Ellen stood and walked to the window. When Dad died, we found them in his office. 17 notebooks, just like he'd always said. Almost 40 years of daily entries. She turned back. But there was something else, something Dad never mentioned. She returned with a small wooden box containing photographs and a folded letter. This was on top of the notebooks, written by my grandfather in 1951. Sarah unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible. To whoever reads these words, I have lived 40 years in growing darkness. The notebooks lay spread across Sarah's hotel room desk, arranged chronologically. Ellen had insisted on being present while Sarah reviewed them, protective of her grandfather's legacy. The first notebook, dated January 1912, began with a single stark entry. Age 34. I have noticed for 2 years now that I cannot see well at dusk. Last week, I stumbled over a toolbox I should have seen. Today I visited Dr. Harrison in Boston. He examined my eyes and grew very quiet. Retinitis pigmentosa, he said. There is no cure. You will lose your peripheral vision first, then eventually all sight. It may take 20 years, perhaps 40. I asked about my children. He said it could be inherited. I walked home in complete darkness for the first time in my life, and I was terrified. Sarah looked up at Ellen, who nodded. Keep reading. The entries continued, methodical and unflinching. Thomas documented every change. The gradual narrowing of his visual field, increasing difficulty with night vision, the way bright lights became painful. But interspersed with clinical observations were practical innovations. March 1913. I have begun memorizing the exact position of every tool in my workshop. I practice finding them with my eyes closed. If I cannot trust my peripheral vision, I must trust my memory and my hands. July 1914. At the plant, I've developed a system. I run my fingers along the workpiece before cutting, feeling for imperfections my eyes might miss. The other machinists think I'm eccentric. Better they think me strange than blind. But it was entries from the 1920s that revealed Thomas's deeper purpose. April 1923. Robert is 20 now. I've watched him carefully. Last month he mentioned difficulty seeing stars. The same age I first noticed problems. I haven't told Mary yet. I cannot bear to see the fear in her eyes. But I must prepare Robert. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. This wasn't just medical documentation. It was a father's love letter to the future. Ellen handed her a tissue. Grandfather died before Dad's vision got really bad, but Dad said these notebooks saved his career, maybe his life. Back in Boston, Sarah worked 18-hour days, digitizing and analyzing Thomas Reed's notebooks. She'd brought in Dr. Marcus Williams, a leading RP specialist from Mass General, to review the findings. Together, they sat in Sarah's office, surrounded by screens displaying Thomas's meticulous observations. Look at this progression, Marcus said, tracing a graph Sarah had created from the data. Thomas documented his visual field loss over 39 years. This is the longest continuous self-reported data set of RP progression I've ever seen. The graph showed slow but relentless narrowing. In 1912, Thomas had estimated his peripheral vision at near normal. By 1925, it had reduced to about 60 degrees. By 1940, just 20 degrees, severe tunnel vision. The final entries in 1951 showed less than 5 degrees remaining. But what made Marcus lean forward was the secondary data. Thomas had tracked not just vision loss but adaptation success. He'd rated his own functional ability in various tasks: work performance, navigation, reading, social interaction. While his vision steadily declined, his functional ability remained relatively high until the very end. He compensated, Sarah said, systematically, intelligently. Look at this entry from 1928. I've realized something crucial. My eyes are failing, but my brain is not. I've trained myself to build mental maps of every space I occupy. I am not becoming blind. I am becoming differently sighted. Marcus sat back. This is revolutionary. We tell RP patients about white canes and guide dogs, but we don't teach them proactive adaptation strategies. Thomas figured this out in 1928, without any support system. Sarah pulled up another document. And look at his advice to Robert from 1935. The entry was several pages long, a detailed tutorial on workplace adaptation. Tell no one until absolutely necessary. Arrange your workspace for maximum efficiency. Use tactile markers on tools. Practice tasks in varying light conditions. It's a survival manual, Marcus said quietly, written by someone who lived it. Sarah opened another file. There's more. Elizabeth is still alive. She's 89, living in Worcester. She wants to talk. Sarah arranged a meeting at Ellen's house with the extended Reed family. 4 generations gathered, Ellen and her brother Daniel, both living with RP, their children, some affected, some not, and Daniel's 12-year-old granddaughter Sophie, recently diagnosed. Sophie sat quietly beside her mother, her eyes large and frightened behind new glasses. Sarah recognized that fear. She'd seen it in countless patients' faces. Ellen began by sharing the notebooks, now digitized and printed in large type. Great-grandfather Thomas wanted us to know we're not alone. He lived with RP for 40 years, worked, raised a family, had a full life. Daniel turned to Sophie. "Sweetheart, I want you to read something." He handed her a notebook entry from 1938. Sophie read aloud, her voice shaking. "Today I taught Robert my workshop system. He's struggling with night vision now, just as I did at his age. I showed him how to paint tool outlines, how to count steps, how to memorize layouts. But more importantly, I told him, this condition will change how you see the world, but it doesn't have to change who you are. You are not your diagnosis. Adapt with purpose, with courage, and with hope." Sophie wiped her eyes. "He sounds brave." Ellen leaned forward. "He was terrified, Sophie. The notebooks make that clear. But he chose to be brave anyway. That's what courage is." Sarah opened her laptop. "I've been analyzing Thomas's techniques and comparing them to modern vision rehabilitation methods. Many things he figured out independently are now standard practices. But some of his innovations are new to us." She displayed a chart. Thomas developed a numerical system for describing light levels and his functional vision in different conditions. He noticed his vision was significantly better on overcast days than sunny ones. The diffuse light was easier on his damaged retinas. Sarah turned to Sophie. "Your great-great-grandfather also wrote specifically about young people with RP. Would you like to hear it?" Sophie nodded. Sarah read, "To the young ones, I know you're scared. I was too. You have a condition that will require adaptation, but humans are remarkable adapters. Trust the process. Trust yourself." Sophie looked up. "Can I keep my own notebook, like he did?" Sarah smiled through tears. "I think Thomas would love that idea." 2 months later, Sarah presented her findings at the International Symposium on Retinal Degenerative Diseases in Chicago. The auditorium was packed with researchers, clinicians, and patient advocates. Her presentation title, "Lessons from the Past, a 40-year longitudinal case study of retinitis pigmentosa self-management, 1912 to 1951. She began with the photograph, projected on the massive screen. Thomas Reed's face, his eyes hiding their secret, now revealed through digital amplification. "This photograph was taken in 1914, Sarah said. For 110 years, it sat in albums, passed down through generations. No one noticed what was hidden there until last year, when high-resolution scanning revealed these patterns." She zoomed in on the retinal detail. The man in this photograph, Thomas Reed, lived with progressive retinitis pigmentosa for approximately 40 years. He was never formally studied by medical researchers, but he did something perhaps more valuable. He studied himself. Sarah displayed pages from the notebooks. For 39 years, Thomas documented every aspect of his vision loss and his adaptation to it. These 17 notebooks contain over 3,000 pages of daily observations, creating the longest continuous first-person account of RP progression we have in medical literature. She walked the audience through the data. Vision field measurements, light sensitivity patterns, functional adaptation strategies. Researchers leaned forward, taking notes. Several were openly crying. "But the most important contribution isn't the clinical data," Sarah continued. "It's Thomas's documentation of successful adaptation. He worked full-time for over 40 years with progressive RP. How?" She presented Thomas's techniques systematically: memorization protocols, tactile marking systems, strategic workspace design, careful social navigation that allowed him to maintain employment without revealing his condition. Dr. Patricia Anderson from Johns Hopkins stood during Q&A. "Dr. Mitchell, this is extraordinary, but I'm troubled. Thomas Reed hid his condition his entire working life because disability was stigmatized. Are we romanticizing what was actually a tragedy of social injustice? Sarah nodded. You're absolutely right. Thomas's story is both inspiring and heartbreaking. He shouldn't have had to hide. After the presentation, a young woman approached. Dr. Mitchell, I'm Rachel. I was diagnosed with RP 2 years ago. My doctor sent me these notebooks last month. They changed everything. Sarah hugged her. That's exactly what he wanted. 6 months after the symposium, Sarah received an email from Sophie. Attached was a photo. Sophie standing at her school's science fair beside a poster titled Adapting to Vision Loss, Lessons from My Great-Great-Grandfather. The poster displayed excerpts from Thomas's notebooks alongside Sophie's own observations about her early experience with RP. She'd documented her first month using his techniques, memorizing classroom layouts, marking textbooks with tactile tabs, practicing navigation with reduced lighting. Sarah called her immediately. Sophie, your project is amazing. I won second place in the regional competition. Sophie's voice bubbled with excitement. And Dr. Mitchell, something incredible happened. One of the judges has RP too. She asked if she could read his notebooks. I gave her the website you created. The website, www.thomasreedlegacy.org, had gone live 3 months earlier. Sarah had worked with Ellen's family to create a comprehensive resource featuring Thomas's complete notebooks, annotated by modern vision specialists, plus video interviews with his descendants and contemporary RP patients. The sites had over 10,000 visitors, Sarah told Sophie. We're hearing from RP patients around the world. Ellen had been the driving force behind making the notebooks public. Grandfather hid his condition because he had to, she'd said, but his knowledge shouldn't stay hidden. Now Sarah sat in Ellen's living room once again, along with Daniel, Sophie, and several other family members. They were preparing for a special event. The Lynn Historical Society was unveiling an exhibit about Thomas Reed. I've been thinking, Ellen said, adjusting her thick glasses, about what Grandfather would make of all this. He was such a private man. Daniel shook his head. Read the last entry again, Ellen. He wrote it for exactly this purpose. Sophie added quietly, when I read his notebooks, I feel like he's talking directly to me. Like he knew I'd exist someday and need to hear what he learned. The exhibit opening drew over 200 people. The centerpiece was the original 1914 photograph, professionally restored, with detailed explanation of the retinal patterns that had started everything. Sophie was asked to speak. She stood at the podium, finding her confidence. My great-great-grandfather Thomas was scared, but he did something with that fear. He turned it into a gift for the future. The audience stood and applauded. 1 year after the photograph first crossed Sarah's desk, she returned to the Boston Historical Society's archive. The director, Dr. James Wu, had called with intriguing news. They'd found more of Thomas Reed's possessions. Estate sale, James explained, leading her to a back room. Elizabeth passed away last month. Her children were clearing her house and found a trunk they'd never opened. Inside was a letter addressed to the Historical Society of Lynn or Boston, to be opened 50 years after my death. Thomas died in 1952, but the trunk was forgotten. On the table lay the trunk's contents, more notebooks, several thick envelopes of photographs and technical drawings. Sarah opened the envelope marked Explanation. Inside was a typed letter dated November 1951. My name is Thomas Reed. If you are reading this, I have been dead at least 50 years, and perhaps the world has changed enough to understand what I tried to do. In 1912, I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. I have spent 40 years hiding my condition, adapting to it, documenting it. But I have also spent 40 years trying to understand it. With help from Dr. Harrison of Boston, I obtained access to ophthalmological equipment. I photographed my own retinas yearly, tracking the degradation. I experimented with different lighting conditions. I measured my visual fields with homemade equipment. Why? Because I believed understanding my enemy might help me fight it. And because others would come after me, my children, my grandchildren, strangers facing the same darkness, and they would need more than fear. They would need knowledge. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined the additional materials. The retinal photographs were crude, but showed clear progression. The visual field maps were meticulous. Most remarkable were the experimental logs. Thomas had systematically tested different variables: red light versus white light, various font sizes, navigation techniques. "This is unprecedented," Sarah said. Thomas essentially conducted a 40-year clinical trial on himself. One photograph made her catch her breath. Taken in 1950, it showed Thomas in his garden, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He was smiling, his nearly blind eyes squinting in sunlight. In his hands, he held a notebook. On the back, "Family Gathering, June 1950. Finished notebook 16, one more to go. Robert knows about the trunk, told him to wait 50 years. By then, the world might be ready." Sarah worked with specialists to analyze Thomas's self-collected data. Their findings were published with the conclusion, Thomas Reed's legacy transcends scientific data. He transformed personal suffering into collective knowledge, private fear into public courage. 3 months later, Sarah received an email from Sophie. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm starting high school next year, and I've decided what I want to study. Biology and medicine. Because of great-great-grandpa Thomas, I'm not afraid anymore. I want to help find better treatments. He couldn't cure himself, but he made it possible for me to try." Sarah opened Thomas's notebooks one more time, scrolling to that final entry. "The night is long, but you will find your way through it." Thomas had found his way, and now, more than 70 years after his death, he was still lighting the path for others. The secret hidden in his eyes wasn't just a medical condition. It was determination, adaptation, love, and an unwavering belief that the future could be better. Some secrets are worth keeping until the world is ready to understand them. Thomas had known that all along.